we're going to get started. There's some people still coming in, but that's okay. We'll get started. Welcome to KW. It's great to have. This is our third. Wow, this is our third series that Angela Zykowski put together. We sort of talked about the idea of putting a series together that would help people out and answer a lot of questions, which I think has been really informative. So I'm just going to give a quick overview. Angela Zykowski oversees the day-to-day operations of the Vermont Landlords Association. She serves on the legislative study committees and participates in the legislative process through drafting potential legislation and testifying in legislative committees on issues impacting commercial and residential landlords. So needless to say, her knowledge is expansive. She began working with the Vermont Landlords Association in 2003, and she's now a principal member of the association. And she's a frequent presenter of the Vermont Landlords Law and Best Management Practices seminars for both attorneys in continuing legal education and private landlord property managers. Anything else?
I don't know, I recently got appointed to the Vermont Rental Housing Advisory Board.
Who even knew that existed?
It's brand new. Looking
awesome.
at all things rental housing.
That's awesome. How many people here are part of or are member of the Vermont Landlords Association? Quite a few people. Yeah, that's great. Angela can tell you a little bit about that afterwards. Just a couple housekeeping items. Cell phones, if you wouldn't mind turning them off or down to vibrate. We're going to keep the class to 1 hour. We usually try to do a little Q&A at the end. And throughout, actually.
Yes.
You encourage that.
I do. It's more fun for everybody.
Yeah. Bathrooms, if anybody needs them, through this door, or this one. This one's a little bit easier to get to, around on the other side of this wall. And I want to take a second to thank our sponsor, Movement Mortgage. Michael Linguasco is here providing snacks and water, so help yourselves. And without further ado, I'll let you get started.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. So this is our third session, and we're going to talk about leases today, or what's a lease got to do with it. If you missed our first two on the new marijuana law or termination notices, those are all up on the Landlords Association YouTube channel, so you can go back and watch them again in case you missed something or weren't here the first time. We've put them out there, so forevermore people can watch me on the intertubes. Yay. All right, some preliminaries when we are talking about leases. So state statute, and I'm going to refer to state statute a lot for those of you who, if you're not familiar, it's in Title IX, Chapter 137, and it's the Residential Rental Agreements Act. So this is the big body of legislation that the legislature has passed that governs the landlord-tenant relationship when we're talking about residential properties. So everything today and everything in this series is focused on residential properties. When we get to the commercial side, so like renting to retail businesses or any place where somebody's not living, that's a whole different kettle of fish with a whole different seminar series. We could probably do at some point. So the state has defined what a rental agreement is. So they say you can have a verbal agreement, you can have a written agreement, but it's basically anything that covers what the deal is. It's really broad, right? It could be anything. And we've seen it. We've seen everything. They also define who a tenant is. So a tenant is defined as the person under this agreement that has the right to occupy the property to the exclusion of others. This definition of tenant actually has become very, very important more recently as we've had this new body of law passed to deal with what we're referring to as unauthorized occupants. So these are the people that your tenant lets move in, that you don't have on your written lease, and we now have a different way of dealing with them. They're not legally considered tenants, which is a good thing. So these definitions are kind of important. All right, how many of you, I'm going to ask the easy question, how many of you are using written leases? Okay, good. It's always advised. I hear a lot of flack from landlords, right? I deal with a lot of landlords who are dealing with the relationship that's broken down. I don't have landlords calling me up being like, hey, I just want to tell you I have this great tenant. Every once in a while that might be nice to hear. We've never leased and it's awesome. I don't get those kind of calls. I get all the other calls, right? When the relationship has gone sour or south. And a lot of times I hear from folks, well, why should I even have this written lease? I can't do anything about it. I can't enforce. You actually can, right? That whole other seminar we did a month ago was about how you can enforce your lease. Maybe we should have flip-flopped those seminars. But you can. You just have to follow the process that's been set out in statute, which is sending a termination notice and then going to court if the tenant doesn't do what they're supposed to. But the only way you can do that a lot of times is if you have this lease that says, here's what the rules are. So always advised. Quickly about security deposits, because this comes up a lot. I get a ton of questions about security deposits, and this relates into lease agreements. So state statute, again, very broad. Like, legislature likes to put forward these really broad definitions. It's any prepaid money that the tenant's paying up front. I have some landlords that like, oh, well, this is the deposit, and this is the carpet cleaning fee, and this is the other fee. I'm like, no, it's all a deposit. You gotta deal with it. This is the one area where landlords get the most tripped up. And sometimes we see leases downloaded off the internet that are not the Landlords Association website, those other websites that say we have a Vermont compliant lease, that don't highlight some of these issues for you. So 14 days after the tenant leaves the property, or you discover the tenant has left the property. We got this little second one added in because what was happening? Tenants were scooting out in the middle of the night and landlord wouldn't find out about it for 3 or 4 days. And then the tenant would be like, well, I moved out 4 days earlier. And landlords were missing the 14-day deadline. And they were getting whacked in court. So now it's, when you discover it, you got to send them an itemized list of deductions and return any balance. This is a big one. Because I always hear, well, I can't get this work done in 2 weeks. Well, of course. Sometimes you can't get the work done. You can use estimates. My suggestion is, if you got 2 estimates and one's higher than the other, use the higher one. Because what's, any project that you have, how many of you have contractors that have come in spot on whatever they've quoted you for whatever project you've hired them to do? Anybody? No? Okay, that's not been my experience. Because stuff happens, right? They find other things, or you find more stuff, or something changes, or the project's bigger than what they thought when they looked. So, but really important, that 14 days, it's a postmark deadline. There's a lot of tenants that are like, I didn't receive it within the 14 days, so you can't keep my deposit. No, it's a postmark deadline. Just make sure you get it in the mail. It's not tied to the lease term, it's tied to the occupancy. So if a tenant moves out and they still have 7 months left on their lease, they need to get it within 14 days, or it needs to be sent within 14 days of them leaving, not when the lease is over. So that's another part where we see landlords get tripped up. All right, so the exciting stuff. The lease. We already covered both written and verbal. Again, you're going to see some themes through here. Please don't do verbal leases. They're tough for everybody to understand. It's kind of like that game of telephone, right? Like if we started over here and I whispered something in his ear and it went across, by the time I got over to Mike in the back, it would not even resemble what it started as over here. And that's just because everybody perceives and remembers things differently. So if they're written down, we can alleviate a lot of problems. Yes?
I have a question on going back to if the tenant is leaving before the end of the lease.
Yes.
And maybe they've called and said, or you don't know they're leaving, why would I give it, they're still responsible for the lease.
Yeah.
So why would I be worried about giving them their security deposit right back?
You wouldn't be returning the deposit, but you would be sending them a letter saying, I'm retaining your deposit because
Okay.
you still have 7 months left on your lease. We find a replacement tenant.
Do I have to do that every time?
Within the 14 days.
Within 14.
Yep. So one of the things I hear a lot is we like to name documents, give documents different names. And we think, or landlords seem to think, that if we call it something different, it's not really a lease. So a rental agreement is the same thing as a lease agreement, which is the same thing as a lease, which is the same thing as something you wrote on a cocktail napkin, which both you and the tenant signed. So whatever you call it, if you're talking about what's happening within the rental unit, it's a lease. And I know in some other states, there's legal differences between an actual lease agreement, rental agreement, but here, they're all the same. All right, the fun stuff. What should be in your lease? Nuts and bolts. This is a big one. What is being leased? This might be just the address and unit number if you have a multi-unit building. But does that multi-unit building have a backyard? Is the tenant allowed to use the backyard? Is there space in the basement, or does this particular unit have access to the basement? Can they store things in the basement? If you're renting a single family home, I've seen situations where the tenant's just renting the home. There's a detached, sometimes a detached, sometimes it is an attached garage, which landlord's like, nope, I'm not renting you the garage. And the landlord has their own set of things that they store in the garage. But that's all stuff that needs to be described in what the tenants, what are they renting? This should have the whole address as well. The E911 address is preferred. I think E911 has gone most of the way through Vermont to standardize addresses. Every once in a while, I'll still see a lease that has like rural route X box 12, and you're like, oh, you need to update your lease. But it's a standardized practice. You might run into it in municipalities where they haven't completed it. So with E911, you can't have a building address of 127-131 Main Street. E911 requires that the building be 131 Main Street, apartment A, B, C, D, because if they send emergency people to the building, they don't need the emergency personnel trying to figure out which unit's 131 and which unit's 127 and which unit. So anyway, so we occasionally with older leases, and if you're buying a property, you may run into that. If you see something like that, that may be something that needs to get updated after you purchase the property, so it's clear that the address matches everything else. Do you have a question?
I've got a duplex.
Yep.
Up and down.
Yep.
So I've got 14 and 16. Sometimes I do 14 slash. Leases are separate, but I've got 14 and 16 on the front.
Yep. Yep. And at some point that might change in your location. You could also say, 14 Main Street, parens, upstairs unit. Right, we see that as well, like some additional clarification, so it's very clear what we're talking about.
911, would that be?
When E911 gets to where your building is, they're going to either switch it to 14, whatever your street name is, or 16, whatever your street name is, and then make you do a A, B, or a 1, 2.
Right.
Yeah.
So, can I just clarify? Because I have one in Burlington, and each address has a different number on North Avenue, 26, 28.
Yeah.
That's not right?
It might be changing.
Oh.
So
Did somebody tell it that?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. But if you right now have a building that has, say, 4 units in it, and this one's 26, and this one's 28, and this one's 30, and this one's 32, and nobody's told you different, that's what I would go with right now.
Okay, thanks.
At some point, that may change to where they just say this whole building is 32, and you have A, B, C, D units.
Okay.
I know, it's every time they change one of these systems, it causes everybody. I had one client who the whole street name changed at some point. That was awesome. When we were like right in the middle of an eviction when it happened, or had just sent termination notices, so then all of a sudden the address is wrong. It was really fun. It was really fun. Who's the tenant? This is an important one. Who are you renting to? Everybody who's 18 or over, who's going to be living in that unit, should be named on the lease as a tenant and should sign the lease. Some landlords like to just have, well, I'm just going to have a lease in the name of one tenant. It's just easier for me. From a legal standpoint, you want anyone who's 18 or over named on that lease and signing the lease. You could have, they can designate like a spokesperson or your point of contact with one of them, that's fine. One check, like for rent, that's fine. They all need to be on the lease.
How do you define them?
How do you?
By name?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
I usually make them give me where they're living, put that in there as well.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, you might have a situation where you have like a co-signer. If you have somebody that's signing on behalf of your tenant, right, so maybe they don't meet your screening criteria and you need some additional assurances that they're going to be able to pay the rent, whoever that co-signer person is, don't put them on the lease as a tenant because they're not technically a tenant, they're not living there. But use a separate, and the apartment owner's lease has a co-signer clause at the end that you can use or not use. That's a more appropriate place for them. And the reason why that's important is when you get into sending termination notices, the termination notice needs to go to anybody who's a tenant. So if you have somebody named on the lease as a tenant who's not actually living there, you do technically need to send them a notice. It makes something that shouldn't be super complicated a lot more complicated and creates a situation where people who want to make arguments to have your case thrown out and make things go a lot longer have some areas where they could be like, whoa, you didn't send it to Mary Smith. She's named as a tenant. I'm like, well, but she doesn't live there. Well, she didn't get a notice. Yeah, I mean, it's just, it creates issues where you don't need issues. Who's the landlord? This one seems like it would be pretty straightforward. It's not. Some people, the property is owned by an LLC. They interact with the tenant themselves. Maybe they have a separate management company that they run to deal with the tenant questions or tenant screening. And I've seen every version of any of those entities as the landlord. Technically, the landlord is the entity that owns the building. So whoever's on that title, if it's you as the individual landlord, that's the name that should go on the lease. If your building's owned in an LLC, the LLC should be the landlord. If you have a management company that you're running rentals through, that's not the landlord. If you hire somebody to screen and find you tenants, they're also not the landlord. It should be whoever owns that building.
So if you're leasing a building from somebody, they still need to be on the lease if you're renting, like you're a rental company?
The landlord still needs to be on the lease. I mean, you can give the rental company the authority to sign that lease on your behalf, but whoever is the owner of that building should be the landlord named on the lease. And this becomes important when you're dealing with enforcement. And you have to go to court to deal with a tenant that you want out of the building. Because the proper plaintiff in an eviction action is the owner of the real estate. That's who needs to get named as the plaintiff. And we can run into legal complications if that's different than the person on the lease and we don't have a good explanation, or we have to name all of those people as plaintiffs. And then you could run into some legal arguments about enforceability and who has the right to enforce that lease. So from a purely legal ease of dealing with problems on the other end standpoint, it should be whoever owns the real estate.
Would you name the management company like in there somewhere then if like say the owner of the building had nothing to do with it?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's all going to go through the management company. Would you name them somewhere in there so that way the tenants aren't like, wait, who am I talking to?
Right. That's one way to do it. I mean, if the management company is managing, they are going to be the point of contact where the person might get confused is if the actual landlord then showed up, but they're going to continue to deal with the landlord or the property management company, but just legal paperwork format, right? I mean, for those of you who are realtors, you run into this with your purchase and sale contracts, right? You have to be pretty specific about who the buyer and who the seller is. And sometimes there's more than one, and maybe you're just dealing with one party. It's the same, it's a legal document, so it needs to be consistent all the way through. You could have a clause in the lease if you're a management company that says, you know, landlords authorized ABC management company to deal with this rental. Something so they're just acknowledged in the lease. It doesn't have to be though. So it seems pretty straightforward. What's the monthly rent? When's it due? Sometimes that is harder. I've seen some interesting leases. I have seen ones with the monthly rent is not anywhere in the lease, and you're like, well, what's the rent? I think it would be a pretty big one. Followed up by, you know, when is it due? Is it due on the 1st of the month? Is it due on the 15th of the month? Is it due on the 3rd of the month? 5th of the month? If in the course of signing a lease, you and the tenant negotiate something different, particularly on when the rent's due, please either do an addendum to the lease or do a change right there and have everybody initial it. Can't tell you how many times I've been sent a lease. It says rent's due on the 1st. I file a case. All my court paperwork says rent's due on the 1st. Inevitably, I get an answer from the tenant. Well, we had an agreement a month after I moved in that I could pay on the 15th. Or I could pay half on the 1st and half on the 15th. Information that would be helpful to have. And then you call the landlord, and the landlord's like, oh yeah, that's how they pay. It's like, well, just, you know, follow up your paperwork. One of the reasons why I harp so much on paperwork is it provides a presentation that you are doing, that you know what you're doing, and that you run a good business, right? Part of what we are trying to do is reduce problems for you when and if you have, and I'm going to say when, because at one point it probably was maybe, well, if you have to do an eviction. Now I think it's a matter of if you have to, or when you have to do an eviction, right? You can do everything perfectly right in terms of screening tenants. You will eventually run into a problem with a tenant. It's inevitable. So let's make sure all of our paperwork's in a good form to ease that process once you get to court. That's not a really fun process for anybody, except for me maybe, but yeah.
Angela, I know someone who just signed a lease in New York. There's
Yeah.
a $75 penalty if they miss the first of the month payment.
Yeah.
What is the current status in Vermont on doing something?
So the current legal standard, it's not statute, it's one of these great case law situations where the court is, actually Vermont Supreme Court has taken a look at this, and the current legal standard is it must be reasonably related to your cost of collection. And as soon as I figure out what the heck that means, I'll let all of you know. I can tell you $75 is not it.
It's too much.
Too
time
high.
Is valuable.
I know it is. I have seen one case where like a housing authority was trying to pursue a $20 late fee, and the court was like, you haven't been able to justify your time on this. So here's my thought on late fees, and then I'll get over to your question. I think you can put them in your lease. I usually recommend somewhere between $20 and $25, just a flat rate. There's also an option of doing like a prompt payment discount.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's what we got.
your rent's $1,000. If you pay on or before the 1st of the month, we'll reduce it to $950. My caution with that is you have to have the mindset that the rent's $1,000, which means if you're collecting a security deposit, you need to collect $1,000. If you're collecting last month's rent, you need to collect $1,000, not $950. So I've had at least one judge in the state, when the landlord had a prompt payment discount in a scenario like that, collected a deposit of $950. The judge looked at me and said, well, isn't this just a disguised late fee? And the rent's really $950. And I responded with something I'm sure very intelligent and glib, and she just was not buying it. at all. So we had a rent of $950. So there is sort of this movement with some traction that this prompt payment discount is a disguised late fee. So just, my only takeaway was, if you're gonna do it, just make sure you're collecting deposits and other things at that higher rent and advertising at the higher amount, $1,000 versus the reduced amount of $950. So late fees, I think you can have them in your lease. I think you can use them as a management tool. It's not something that we ever collect when we go to court. So when I'm talking to a client, putting together a list of damages for a final hearing, late fees is not something that's on there. One, I don't want any more bad rulings for landlords, which is what we run into. And two, I think the number of hurdles that you have to overcome to even get to the point where you're putting on evidence to get a successful late fee added to your judgment order sort of far outweighs the amount of the late fee. So that's been my sort of operating and recommendation with late fees. So we have a question here and then one behind you.
I only have a duplex is what I was saying. I added a late fee on the lease.
Mm-hmm.
Multiple actually, partway through the lease and then another week or two. In reference to what the bank might assign you with a late fee for not getting the mortgage in, and then what the mortgage folks might assign you for not getting the money in. So it's a 2-ply late fee is what I account.
And I don't know what a court would do with that.
Right.
But I mean, I think that starts to provide that justification. Like, look, if I don't pay my mortgage by X date, this is a fee I incur.
Right.
And I need this money to pay the mortgage. But that's still not reasonably related to the cost of collection, right? That's a penalty that is imposed on you. It's not related to your efforts for trying to collect that money.
It's a penalty that I would get towards me from the mortgage company and the bank.
Right.
Depending if I had the check.
Right. Do you have a question? Okay.
Is there a law against putting a penalty in there if the tenant signed, like if you have a certain amount and you put it in your lease and the tenant signs it and you go over with them and you have them initial it, at that spot, is there a law saying that you can't charge $50 for a late fee? I mean, I understand that you said in court it really doesn't make a difference, but...
So we have a court case that says your late fee must be reasonably related to your cost of collection. And we've had a little bit of direction, right? Because we had a housing authority that the court said, yeah, your $20 late fee, you can't justify it under this standard. So you can't collect it. What happens is, again, with this sort of more wanting to look professional, looking like you know what you're doing, if you have a lease that says $75 late fee, knowing that you're not going to be able to enforce that or even justify it, it causes folks, when we get into a dispute, to start really going through everything else. Well, if this is in here, what else is in here that's not supposed to be in here? So it can create problems. And if you've ever collected any of those $75, so say you have a tenant that's actually paid you some $75, you get into a dispute about rent not being paid, I can guarantee you the next thing you're going to see is either an answer or a letter from somebody at legal aid saying, this tenant's paid seven $75 late fees. That needs to come off of the back rent that's owed because they shouldn't have had to pay those $75 late fees. So it starts to create a dispute where we don't really need a dispute.
So that's the agreement you have with a mortgage with the bank being a penalty is not the same type of penalty that you have in your lease.
Nope.
It's completely different.
Because it's not about collection.
Right. Right. The late fee in the lease is tied to what you have to go through to collect that money, not what penalties you might get because it wasn't paid on time.
So could you rewrite it to reflect that somehow?
Possibly could wordsmith that. I mean, ideally what we'd like to do is get something in statute.
Right.
that says this is an acceptable late fee. But I'm careful where I suggest some of those things, because sometimes we end up with options that was not what we intended to do.
Be careful what you wish for.
Exactly. Exactly.
Actually, that was my question.
Okay.
If the event on overdays happened.
Yeah. Yep. I know late fees is a tough one, because it's all about motivating people to pay on time, right? Because you have bills, you have other things that you need to take care of, and that's been at least my frustration with the disconnect over this, right? I don't make my car payment on time, I get a late fee. I don't make my mortgage on time, I get a late fee. I'm a tenant, I don't pay my rent on time, who cares? Right?
It's true.
Yeah, don't pay your credit card on time. Well, all kinds of things happen. But rental, doesn't matter. Nobody cares. So, I mean, I think this is going to take sort of a legislative change to get something, and clearly it seems like the easiest path is a percentage of whatever the rent is, right? What's the standard for late payment for mortgages? 5%? 5% of whatever your mortgage payment is? I mean, even at 2.5% of whatever the rent is, you're probably talking about a number that's bigger than what landlords are able to do right now. So,
If you can't, if they can't pay the rent, more than likely they can't pay the penalty either.
right, there's that too. Right.
I mean, you can say whatever you want, but you're not gonna get it.
Right. Do we have, is there another question? Or? Okay. Who's responsible for the utilities? This could be a big one. How many of you guys have rented to somebody who's moved in and not switched the utilities over that they were supposed to? Mm-hmm.
I don't let them in.
Well, excellent. Without proof that they've switched it over. This clause, so you have a lease that says, tenant, you're responsible for the electricity, and they don't turn it over right away, or they don't turn it over at all. This is this type of clause that will give me the ability to, or you the ability to send them a breach of lease notice and pursue them for those payments. But if it's not in your lease, it's, the court, if that was an oral agreement, the court would be like, well, it never got turned over, so how do we really know, landlord, that they were supposed to have that utility turned on in their name? So, and it can be important, like if you're renting a single family home where something like the water bill probably can't get put into their name, right? Because the municipalities have figured this out, that if they let it go into the tenant's name, they'll never get paid. So it stays in your name. They might be able to change the address so it gets sent to the tenant, but it's not going to be able to come out of your name, so it's important to have that kind of stuff in the lease. Here's one that gets missed a lot in lease. I don't actually have this one in the apartment owner's lease because this is so property specific, is how is snow removal handled? Who does what? Probably not inconceivable that you as a landlord are paying for whatever parking area to get plowed out, but then are the tenants responsible for shoveling their porches, walkways, egress, or is the tenant responsible for all of it? Something that needs to be in the lease. And again, very property specific.
Can I just go back 1 second for who's responsible for the utility?
Yeah.
If you have multiple people on the lease
Mm-hmm.
and Joe says, you just say that the tenant's responsible.
Correct.
Who do you go after if Joe was supposed to do it or Joe doesn't
Well-
pay or?
Well, hopefully you have a lease that says the tenants are joint and severally liable, which means you can go after one of them or all of them, and you can pick and choose. So they're all technically responsible if they're on the lease.
So for your joint and severally liable, is that like in the first paragraph and it goes through for everything, or does it have to be for each item, like for
No, you just
utilities?
have one section. Ours is in the back. It's with all the other fun legalese stuff that just says tenants are joint and severally liable for all the obligations in this lease.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's a hard lesson when, you have like a group and you can find one of them.
Right.
Or maybe only one of them's left, the other three have moved out. But that's not fair. You're right. Sorry.
You can go after all of them for the same amount until you get paid, right?
Exactly. But it's always a tough one for that one college kid that got left behind and his roommates bailed on him and the rent's like $2,700 a month. And now you're like, it's all on you. Well, but my share was on. Yeah, the lease says $2,700.
But it was in the lease.
But it's in the lease. Sorry, if you know where your roommates are, I would suggest that perhaps you find them. So, lawn care, this is another one, same sort of thing. Who's going to be responsible for it? I'm here to tell you that most of the time, your idea of what's appropriate lawn care and your tenant's ideas of what is appropriate lawn care are not the same. This is probably one of these things that just probably makes sense for you to take care of or have somebody take care of it on your behalf. Please don't barter with your tenants for rent reductions. I run into that occasionally where the landlord will be like, okay, the rent's $750, but if you mow the lawn during the summer, you can reduce your rent to $700. I'm going to guarantee you that they're not going to do the job that you think they should be doing, and then you're going to get into a huge dispute about whether rent's owed or not. And there's also some tax issues there. But it's okay if your tenant has some skills and you want to pay them separately that's independent from the rent situation to mow the lawn or weed or take care of that. But treat them like you would any other contractor that's coming on. They need to pay the rent in full. You pay them whatever you've agreed to for that service. But generally, if something's going to go wrong, that's where there's going to be a friction point.
Okay, so if you pay your tenant to do some lawn care and they get hurt, they sue you? Or how do you protect yourself? Or if the tenant is responsible for snow removal and they slip and fall?
Well, if they're responsible for snow removal and they slip and fall, any sort of accident's going to be like, it's not what's called strict liability. It's not they get hurt, it's automatically your fault. It's always going to be a question of, did they slip and fall because there were no handrails where they were shoveling? That could create some liability for you. Did they slip and fall because they fell through a step? Did they slip and fall because they just weren't paying attention? Like sometimes things just happen and there's accidents. So it's always going to be a really fact-specific question. And you, as the owner of the real estate, if something happens, you're always going to be the one that people are pointing the finger at no matter what the facts are. And that's part of the reason why you carry insurance, right? Among other, in case your building burns down or, some other stuff like that. But that's one of the reasons why you carry insurance, because if that happens, your insurance company, that's why you pay them. Step in, help with that. And maybe the person does have a legitimate claim that needs to get paid. That's why you carry that stuff.
So what would you suggest, an umbrella policy with a minimum of what?
Depends on how many units you have or what you're talking about, but,
A single family home.
Couple million. I mean, stuff adds up quickly if somebody gets seriously hurt.
Especially lawyers for these.
Oh, I know, we're terrible. We're horrible. We're the worst. Lawyers, terrible.
When it comes to liability, you want to do a couple of things. You want to maximize the liability on your primary residence. You can usually go to $1 million from $500,000 for like $28 a year. You want to make sure that you have at least $1 million on the property that you're renting, and at least $1 million on the umbrella, and that runs you about $218, $220 a year on the umbrella. So you're not talking a lot of money to be able to get a little bit more coverage.
Right.
So
And
having separated that with your primary or?
You don't. You maximize everything you can for the cheapest amount that you can, because when they come after you, they're coming after all your limits of liability.
Well, and generally the umbrella will cover more than just the rental property. So we cover you like if you got into an automobile accident or you had some sort of issue. Like that's why it's an umbrella. Like it
Covers
just
everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I always joke I have so much insurance that I probably shouldn't tell my husband I might actually be worth more dead than alive. A lot of insurance. Has the tenant paid the security deposit? Hopefully everybody is making sure the tenant pays the deposit before you give them the keys and let them move in. Don't like to see payment plans on security deposits. Though, of course, the ones that work out, right? The landlord's not calling me up to be like, hey, I did this payment plan on the deposit and the tenant paid. I get the check bounced call, the like they were supposed to pay and didn't pay. Like, again, it's an indication that somebody doesn't have the money to afford the apartment or the rental. They can't pay the upfront costs. Might want to think twice about them. Okay, answer should be yes. And how much is the deposit? Again, it's all of that prepaid money, and it needs to get listed in the lease in the section that's talking about security deposits and how much they've paid. Yes.
One other quick question. You have your tenant has signed your lease,
Mm-hmm.
you collected the security deposit,
Mm-hmm.
and then they bail or they can't. But then what do you do?
Well, you have a signed lease at that point. You have a contract.
So they're
With
still
them.
responsible.
They're still responsible. I would say you need to send them some notification that, hey, we're retaining your deposit towards this lease obligation. We're going to try to find a new tenant, but they've signed a contract with you.
Can you keep the security deposit?
I would argue, yeah. I mean, yes, unless you're able to find a replacement tenant that would come in at the same time they were. Yeah. Yeah.
Just want to make sure.
Quick clarifying question on deposits. My understanding is that you can charge, like, say, I want to charge them a month and a half's rent
Mhm.
or whatever for a deposit. I can do that, but I can't charge them like a month's rent and a last month's rent. You can't do a last month's rent, is that right?
Unless you're renting in Burlington or Barrie, you absolutely can charge them whatever you want up front.
Really? Oh.
What, say that again?
Burlington and Barrie are the only two places where there's a restriction on how much money you can collect up front from a tenant. So if you rent outside of Burlington and outside of Barrie, you could collect first, last, and security. You could collect first month's and a security that's equal to 2 months' rent. You could collect 3 months' rent up front, security deposit 3 times the rent. Whatever the market will bear. So those two municipalities have placed restrictions on what landlords can collect. So if you're renting in Burlington, you can only collect the equivalent of 1 month's rent. Same thing with Barrie. So if you're renting to tenants that have been in the Burlington market, you may get the like, well, you can't collect last month's rent. Yeah, you can. This is Colchester.
Can you collect a pet deposit fee in Burlington?
You can up to a half a month's rent. So an additional half month's rent if there's a pet.
Is that a deposit or a fee?
It's a deposit. So it would be returnable if there was no damage to the unit. They would get it back at the end.
But you can do a
There's-
fee as well?
I'll get to that. There's no non-refundable deposits in the state of Vermont. I have seen landlords institute a pet rent for pets.
And they're on the lease.
Yeah.
Yeah, the pet rent is listed out on the lease.
And they can the pet's name.
Probably, yeah. That one hasn't been challenged. So we'll see. For right now, totally fine.
I have an addendum for anybody who has pets. It's not specific to a lease, but it is specific to, they have to register with the health officer. They have to have all the annual shots, and I have to have a note from their vet saying that everything's up to date.
Yep. And if that animal comes in as what's called an emotional support animal, and we can talk a lot, we talked about it last time some, but we can talk about it the next one some more, then all of those fees and things go out the door because you can't charge any of that, so.
I'm test driving petscreening.com. It has them go on, they pay a fee, I think it's like 15 or 20 bucks, and it gives you a pet profile.
Mm-hmm.
So that way too, you know if they're switching out pets throughout the lease.
That's good, or picture works. Meet the pet. I mean, if you're going to allow pets in, I would say, particularly with dogs, you want to meet that dog before you even say it's okay. Just to get a sense of, one, how they are with the animal, how the animal behaves when they meet new people. Nobody would probably ever rent to me. I have a yellow lab. She's really excited. She's like 11 months old, so we're still working on a few things with her. But
I always say, bring them along.
exactly.
You know, it's training.
What if your lease doesn't allow pets and, 2 months into renting, they bring a dog to your apartment building?
You can evict them for that.
What is for emotional support?
That's different. I mean, if the animal comes in, if it's an emotional support animal, it's causing problems, it's barking. I mean, you can have almost the same addendum that Mike uses for pets, for emotional support animals. You can still require certain behaviors out of the animal, and if they're not following that, you can evict them. I have successfully evicted tenants who have emotional support animals for the behavior of that emotional support animal that they refuse to get rid of. You can do it.
So are you just getting rid of the animal, or are you getting rid of the tenant?
Well, in the case I had, I got rid of the tenant because she didn't want to get rid of her animal. But I think if they were to get rid of the animal, then that would comply with the notice.
I don't think you should get rid of the animal, but you actually wanted them to leave too.
That, I haven't, that could be the case in some situations. I actually haven't had a landlord that's wanted to spend the money to test that question. I get it. They complied with the breach notice. Let's move forward and find something else. Inevitably, there'll be something else.
Have you run into a situation where, say, a condo association does not allow animals, so all of a sudden this one person comes in with an emotional support animal, they have to be allowed in, all of a sudden another guy over here saying, well, that woman has a dog, I have emotional support too, and all of a sudden it becomes a flurry of the condo association now almost being forced to accept dogs?
Yep, because they're bound by the same fair housing rules that landlords are. And there's currently no limit on the number of emotional support animals one person can have.
Do they have to have documentation?
They have to have they have to provide some documentation from somebody that knows, so that they have a disability and that this animal is going to alleviate some component of the disability. It's a very low standard. I would say anybody in this room could go to their doctor and get a note that says they needed an emotional support animal.
Is Vermont actually addressing that to some degree? Is that just so?
It's not even a Vermont issue, it's a federal. Vermont has its own version of the fair housing rules, but there is a whole body that's developing on the national level around these rules, and that's where a lot of the information is coming from about what's going on, because it's not necessarily happening here, we're just seeing it trickle down from other places. So I will, for the next seminar, bring my book, Fair Housing, which is about this thick, on super thin rice paper. And every year I get an update that's about this thick again, from all the changes for case law that have to do with fair housing. So it's not something that we're going to necessarily be able to address here at the local level. I know. What's the term of the lease? Is the tenant renting from you for a year? Are they just renting on a month-to-month basis? Are they renting on a week-to-week basis? Make sure you have that stated in there. What's the length of time they're going to rent from you? Please don't make it like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 years. All things I've seen. Totally fine to do a 12-month lease. Don't really recommend making it longer than that for initial term. Just try them out, see how it goes. You're going to know by the end of that 12-month period if you want to keep renting to that person or not.
What is the advantage to a landlord of having a month-to-month lease versus a one-year lease?
On a month-to-month lease, you can at any time give that tenant a no-cause notice, which is the I don't have a reason, you just need to leave. If you're in the middle of a year's lease, you have to wait till you're getting close to the end of that lease to be able to use that notice. So, yeah. Some people like your leases because it gives everybody a little stability. I don't generally recommend having year leases that automatically renew for another year. Some landlords really like them because they think it just cuts down on their paperwork, but I can't tell you how many times I've gotten the call, I want to send them a no-cause notice, and you're like, okay, send me over the lease, and you're like, well, this lease just renewed for another year like a month ago, right? And they're like, what? You're like, yeah. So we're going to have to wait another 11 months before we send the no-cause notice. You should have called me 2 months ago. So you really have to keep track of your dates if you're going to have something like an auto renew for a year. Did you have a question?
I was just confused with the no cause. You can only do that a month ahead of the end of the lease. You can't do it midway through.
Well, you can send it midway, but it has to have a termination date that's the end of the lease term. So, and I can say probably chances are if you did that, the next month you're not going to see any rent. So then you're in a no rent situation. So I would just wait. generally recommend waiting until closer to the end of the lease term to use the no cost.
If you do sign month to month, is there a recommended time period for renewing the lease? I believe it's indefinite if you sign it, but
Yeah. I mean, if on a month-to-month, it's just going to auto-renew on a month-to-month basis. Going forward, you don't have to keep redoing paperwork.
I think like 5 years or something like that. Just
I mean, if you're on a month-to-month lease and you update your lease, that's probably a good time to be like, hey, we need to catch this paperwork up and re-sign a new lease. But they could live there for 3-4 years on a month-to-month lease and never change the paperwork. Yeah, all right. Subleasing and assignment. This has never been more important than it is now. This is a clause that says, tenant, you may not sublease or sublease this unit or assign this lease without my written permission. This is a clause that's going to allow you to immediately go to court and have anybody who's not on the lease removed. So we actually have a tool now to enforce this. That's not a full-blown eviction.
Will they know sublease? Period, stand up? You can't sublease that, period.
Yep. Yep. It will. Also, why it's important to have anybody who you've given permission to live there be on the lease. Because when we start talking about these unauthorized occupants, we're talking about folks that aren't on the lease, that you haven't given permission to be there, and that this lease has this subleasing by prohibition. And by fast, I don't want to get anybody's hopes up here. By fast, I mean we can get them out 3 to 6 weeks, and you don't have to send a termination notice to begin with. You can just go right to court. For comparison, if you're evicting a tenant, you have to send a termination notice first, which could be anywhere from 14 to 90 days. And then you start a court process, which at a minimum is 3 to 4 months. So it's fast for court, really slow for real life. And when you have somebody that's causing problems. Generally, these people are causing problems. That's why you want them to go. Right? They're the ones that are creating issues.
what sort of proof would you need as a landlord before you went to court on that? Say you suspect that a boyfriend has moved in.
Mm-hmm.
You see him there every time you're there. But what is a judge going to need to hear as far as proof that you have a sublease in effect?
So far, that you have a written lease that prohibits subleasing, and that person is not on the lease. I haven't actually had the defense show up of, I'm not actually living there.
Or the tenant says, but it's my boyfriend, he's only here one night a week, and you just happen to see him when he's there.
I would require them to bring me proof they live somewhere else. I haven't run into that one. That's a close call. They're generally, they're there.
Oh, yeah. No question, but I'm picturing the tenant saying they're just visiting.
Well,
they're 6 days out of 7.
Prove you live somewhere else.
They really are residing there.
Prove you live somebody else. Well, and our pressure point is with the tenant, right? Because this person, we don't want them there. If we see them there again, you're the one that's going to go next time. Right? I actually got a mom to issue a no trespass order against her daughter to save her own tenancy in this type of situation. Daughter, I'm just staying there. She's just staying here for a little bit. Look, we'll put her in a hotel. We're like, no, she's going to show back up. Give her a week. She'll be right back here. If you don't want to get evicted and lose your subsidy, you sign this no trespass order to keep your daughter away. She did. She did. So.
I think in my lease I had it written that you can't have a visitor for more than 14 consecutive days.
Yep.
Or it needs to be with an agreement of all parties.
Yeah, you can do those. The visitor clauses can be really difficult to enforce. I mean, the big question is, do they have some place else to go? Do they have a lease somewhere else? Do they get their mail somewhere else? Big one is, do they have some place else to go? Where are you living? Where is your stuff? Storage unit, it's not going to cut it.
On the subleasing, can you, in your lease, like he had suggested the boyfriend moving in, if you had somebody move in, like a boyfriend, can you put in your lease, if you have another person move in, the rent will go up to so-and-so, and then can you do that?
I probably wouldn't recommend it just because you could get into some fair housing issues. What if it's a kid? Like, what if you're renting to a couple and then partway through the lease they have a child?
Well,
I mean, these are sort of the things we run into. I think that's something where you could approach that person and say, listen, if he's going to be living here, we need an application from him, and if we approve him, then we're going to have to increase the rent because there's more people that pay more utilities. But that's a conversation that you're going to have, or a decision you're going to have to make with them.
So if somebody did have somebody move in with them and you didn't want them there, you would just go to like the courthouse and file something?
Mm-hmm. I would do this unauthorized occupant and get them tossed out. Yeah.
But then that also goes back to the question where you said 18 and over, everyone
Yeah.
is 18 or over, and that, what if they have a child that's 17 and they turn 18 while they're there?
I'd get
I mean,
them
that is no.
I'd get them to sign a lease addendum that now they're legally a tenant. Mhm. Yep, keep track of that. Yep. Smoking and marijuana. We had a whole seminar about marijuana. You could totally prohibit it, it just has to be in your lease. Same with smoking. Same with smoking. Totally okay to make your entire property non-smoking. I mean, realistically, probably just smoking outside, though we all know what happens when it's raining out or it's 20 below. They're hanging out the window. Maybe if they're polite, they're hanging out the window. If they're not polite, they just have the window up, sitting in their comfy chair, blowing smoke everywhere inside. Yep.
Firearms.
Firearms. You could prohibit firearms.
If someone brought one, if you had it in your lease and then you discovered they had a firearm, you could evict them.
Mm-hmm. You're not the government. You have the right to regulate these things and say we don't want them here. And the enforceability of it could be, how do you know? I mean, you're probably only going to know if there's some sort of incident or something happens or somebody makes a complaint.
After they've left and come back and knock on the door with another tenant and say.
Yeah. Well, you could probably evict them for a whole lot of other reasons, never mind just having a firearm. Right. Renter's insurance. We are definitely recommending that you have a clause in your lease that strongly urges or requires your tenants to get renter's insurance. Your insurance policy that you have, your fabulous insurance policy and umbrellas, do not cover any of their belongings. That building burns to the ground and they don't have renter's insurance, they're not going to get anything from your policy as the owner. It's a very hard lesson for tenants to learn. It also covers them, like if somebody breaks in, steals a laptop, or something gets damaged in their unit. They're relatively cheap if they have a car. It's not a huge amount of money to attach to their current existing insurance policies. Pets. Talked about pets. Condition of the unit at the time the tenant takes occupancy. The easiest way to do this is to use an inspection checklist, where you just walk through. You can walk through with the tenant at the time they move in. Check, check, check. Everything's okay. Everything's okay. You sign it. Tenant signs it. Great. We have this baseline for what the condition is when they move in. Why is that important? Well, if there's damage.
With pictures.
Move out. Pictures are great too. Everything's digital now. So easy to snap like a bunch of pictures or do a walkthrough video and then just store it in the cloud or on a disk or flash drive or whatever works for you. But pictures are great. Yes.
Does the inspection checklist need to be mentioned on the lease? Or
I recommend it. We have confirmed the condition of the unit at the time of moving. See attached inspection checklist. Delivery of possession. This is a really legal mumbo jumbo one. This is a clause that says if you landlord are not able to provide possession of that unit at the time the lease starts, that you have the ability to cancel the lease and return the money they've paid you. Sometimes you're renting units before the current occupant has vacated. And sometimes, although they've told you they're going to leave, they do not leave. And technically, like that tenant who signs the lease with you and then is like, I'm not moving in, which is considered a breach, and if they don't pay you, If you sign a lease with a tenant and don't make it contingent upon your ability to give them possession of that unit, you're technically in breach of your own contract, for which they could sue you for damages and win. And it has happened here in Vermont. I mean, generally you're able to work it out with a person, but sometimes you get the weird one, right? The one that wants to be combative about everything. So this is an important clause for your own protection. And then, are you going to require a cosigner? So if you run into a situation where, this person's marginal, but you'd feel comfortable if you knew you had somebody you could look to if stuff didn't get paid.
Is that deliberate possession thing, is that in the standard lease on the Landlords Association?
Yep. All the stuff's there, except for the smoke, the parking, the snow removal one, because that's so property specific. But yeah, all the rest of this is. Prohibition on alterations. Not allowed to do anything to the unit, including paint. I can guarantee your idea of what's a good paint color and your tenant's idea of what's a good paint color are not the same. Nor the quality in which the paint is applied to the wall. I actually saw pictures where the landlord gave permission to the tenant to paint, and the paint went up to about here, because it was the height at which the tenant could reach with the paintbrush, but couldn't reach any higher. And instead of asking the landlord if they could borrow a ladder, they just left the two-toned. And not even like, hey, this is a cool retro look where, you see the lines and it's two-toned. It was just like roller brush. Really? Why would you want to live like that? All right, quickly. Prohibited lease terms. So these are all things you cannot have in your lease. And occasionally we see them on forms that get downloaded from the internet. Making repairs the tenant's responsibility. Repairs are always your responsibility as the owner. Cannot push that off to the tenant to make those repairs. They could be financially responsible for the repair, but you have the obligation to make sure the repair happens and that you do the repair. 24 hours notice. This is the most common one I see on forms downloaded from the internet. In the state of Vermont, access is with the tenant's consent, on 48 hours notice with or without the tenant's consent, or without notice or consent if it's an emergency.
Are there times during the day? I had seen between...
It's between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m.
Yeah.
And at some point I'd love to get that changed because I don't know too many contractors that start work at 9 a.m. And they get pretty cranky if they can't get in. I think a lot of times that's working with a tenant to just get them, they can consent for somebody to come in sooner or earlier. So that 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. is for that tenant that's like, nope, you can't come in. Well, okay, here's your 48-hour notice and we'll be in. We have this window. And then there's this big catch-all that says anything that contradicts state statute, you can't have in your lease. So this, sometimes the laws change, and leases haven't quite caught up yet. But again, this gets into that like late fee situation or other clauses that aren't enforceable. It's just better to not have them in there. So we don't have people making the argument that like, oh, this is contrary to state statute, so don't have it in there. This is the one case where it could create a problem. If you have a clause in your lease that says we're going to communicate by email, for 90% of the communications you need to do with a tenant, it's totally fine. And probably preferable at this point, right? Because you have a written record of what's being said. If you get into a situation where you have to send a termination notice to that tenant, email is not sufficient notice. It has to be mail or hand delivery. You can also send a copy email, but email by itself is not enough. All right. This one's pretty self-explanatory. Pre-move and do it. Take pictures. Middle of the lease. Do it. Take pictures. When they move out, do it. I'd recommend doing the move out one without the tenant present. You are going to miss things if you have that little person standing over your shoulder watching you. There's no requirement that you do a move out inspection with the tenant present. You're going to be able to be more thorough without somebody following you around. Take pictures. Take pictures during all of these. It's okay to take pictures when the tenant's living there. Don't post them out on the internet because, their personal belongings are there. But you can take pictures to have as proof of this is what the condition is at this day when I come in. Thanks, guys. We ran a little over because we had lots of good questions and there was lots of good information. So I can stay for a little bit if people have more questions. Yes.
You typically do a clause as far as destruction of premises.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a reason you can't fulfill the end of their lease because of partial or total destruction.
Yep. Yeah, and that's in the apartment owners lease. So the question was, do you have a destruction of premises clause where it says generally this would be like in case of a fire. So if the property is destroyed by fire, the lease terminates and money goes. Sometimes it's like a partial destruction, right? So it's going to take 6 months for the unit to get rehabbed. You can use that clause to be like, listen, the lease is canceled. Here's your deposit back. You need to come get your stuff. The stuff is always the tricky part. But yes, that is a good clause to have, and it is in the association's lease.
I have a strange thing going on right now. I have a tenant who lives on the second floor.
Mhm.
Below him
Yeah,
is complaining about noise.
yeah,
And he went down to talk to her and basically said, I'll see you in court. She started with the board basically making it known, and then I had to write, this is someone from out of the country, I had to write a letter, everything he's done to try to mitigate the situation.
mm-hmm.
But what happens in those situations where all of a sudden the board decides that this person's too noisy and want to evict him when it's my tenant?
I mean, they're going to have if the board tries to take some action, they're going to potentially have a proof problem. I mean, they have to prove these violations. This is, when we're talking about behavior issues, this is always the question that's coming up is, one, is the behavior bad enough to warrant somebody losing their housing? And two, you have to actually prove that these violations are happening. Yeah, condos are tough. Condos are tough because you get this mix of rentals and owner-occupied and a group of people that are way too invested in what's going on in each other's condo units and who's parking there. They have lots of rules. They're tough. And, lack of understanding that there's certain things that landlords have to do when dealing with a rental property. And it takes some time sometimes to evict people. See that 3 to 4 months minimum after starting a court case? It can be tough. Nobody likes to live next to a bad neighbor. But, is it really is it really that big of an issue, or is somebody just super sensitive?
Well, he actually never had a complaint of a lower neighbor until this person moved in.
Yeah.
He was there for a year and a half.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is kind of unfortunate. He's from India and just...
Well, and there may be some other things at play there as well. Okay, I'll turn the camera off and we can have an off-camera conversation about what those other things might be.
When you listed about what we can't have on the lease, the 24-hour notice, what is our right? Like, for example, I had this a few weeks ago. A tenant gave the notice that they're moving out, and we had asked her if we could go into the apartment and just look around.
Yep.
When we gave her notice, and then when we got there, she still wouldn't let us in, and we posted on our door, like the officer told us to and stuff.
Yep. Those are tough. I mean, that's the one sort of friction point. It depends on how much you want to push it. I mean, you could have called potentially law enforcement and been like...
No, we didn't.
And when the police showed up, what did they say?
Well, we had called before the situation. We had asked her about it, and we called them, and they said to make a notice on her door and take a picture of it on both her doors and giving her notice. And then when we got there, she still wouldn't let us in.
Yep.
And then after, he said something about we could literally take her to court and do something.
Yeah.
I can't remember what his exact words were, but she ended up letting us in because she moved out.
Right.
She was almost moved out anyways, but we didn't know that until we looked at the apartment.
If she was in the process of moving out, I mean, that's the kind of thing that you can evict tenants for. And generally there's other issues going on when you get to that point where they're not letting you in. Unfortunately for landlords, your ability to enforce any of these things is to court.
Okay. But if there was an emergency...
As soon as there's an emergency, you could just go in. I mean, short of her standing in the doorway you cannot come in. If you've given her proper notice, even if you get that text message, you can't go in, you show up there, she's not there, you can let yourself in if you've given her appropriate notice. That 48 hours is with or without their consent.
But you just don't want it in our leases. Like
The
that
24
says the 24-hour notice.
No, because it's not true.
It's not true.
Right,
So
it's not true.
okay. If there's emergency, you can just go in.
You can go in, yeah. Yeah.
So now I didn't quite understand that. You don't want anything in the lease about access?
No, just that's not compliant with what the statute says.
You can't say 24 hours
Right.
notice in your lease. It's got to say 48.
Right.
Okay.
Right. All right, and our big winner of the door prize, Bob Battling.
Yes.
Did I say that right?
Yes, you did.
Ben, $50 gift card to the Home Depot. There you go.
Thank you,
everybody,
Angela.
for coming.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And we did move next month.